here is the final civil war of the Soviet system, and 100% of the casualties are being felt by former Soviet citizens. From an American point of view, what we're seeing is the single greatest threat ever to the American Republic is in the process of defenestrating itself. There have only been 3 countries in the history of the United States that have ever actually threatened the United States with absolute national oblivion. And so whatever policy set this or that president might want to have that's open or closed or based on trade or strategic issues, there are 3 countries that have always been standouts. The first one is the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is the only country that has invaded the United States, and it did so twice. It's the only power we've ever faced from the Eastern Hemisphere that's actually ever had boots on the grounds within the continental United States. And so there has always been a special place in the American heart for our cultural parents. And decision after decision after decision that was made not just in the early decades, but throughout the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century was about how to handle Britain in a special way so that the Brits finally admit that the United States has grown up and is no longer a teenager. Nations can be very familial. And so that came to a head with World War II. When it became apparent to everyone that the Brits really couldn't fight the war without American assistance, and we had Lend-Lease, and for the low price of 40-odd, wildly outdated and technologically incapacitated destroyers, the United States forced the UK to give up the entirety of its entire military footprint in the Western Hemisphere. On top of that, once we got to the Bretton Woods talks at the end of the war to figure out what the post-war order was, we not only did not give the Brits any special dispensations, we actually charged them in terms of interest on their loans, even more than we charge all the other allies. And that kind of put the United Kingdom into the position that it is today as an American ally that strategically cannot function independently of the United States. There was kind of one more little bit of underlining that happened with the Suez Crisis, where the United States actually threatened publicly that the Brits would have to pay up on all their World War II loans at once, which would have thrown them into a depression, and even offered publicly to ally with the Soviets briefly in order to drive British forces out of Suez. And that was really kind of the last hurrah for the empire as an independent entity. The second country was Mexico. Mexico and the United States shared a border, and between the Texican Rebellion and the Mexican-American War, there was a concern that Mexican troops were going to be able to punch through the Texas territories, especially in the early days of the Texican Rebellion when it didn't look like it was going to be successful, and capture New Orleans. And if that had happened, then the entire American hold on the Middle Continent would have gone away, and that would have meant everything from Ohio to Nebraska would have basically been Mexican territory, and the West Coast would have never happened. So the Mexican-American War happened, and the Americans ended up annexing about half of what had at one point been Mexican territory. Fast forward that a century, and we glared at each other from time to time, but really didn't have relations until we got to the 1980s. And then under Reagan and eventually under Herbert Walker Bush, we negotiated the NAFTA Accords, which are now fully in place, and the two countries are each other's highest demographic intermingling factor and top trading partner. And I don't want to suggest that the relationship is all sunshine and tacos all the time, but we're definitely through the worst of it, and we're building a formal partnership with a renewed set of expectations, just like we have with the United Kingdom. And then there's the third country, the Soviet Union, which started pointing nuclear weapons at the United States as early as 1950. The challenge posed by the Soviets was always different from the previous two, because with the United Kingdom, it was ultimately not a cultural issue. We were from the same cultural stock. It was an issue of control. And in the Mexican issue, it was two neighbors struggling to see who was the dominant power. And it was never going to be a battle for to the death. It was a battle to see who was going to be the big man. But with the Soviets, it was economic, it was strategic, it was ideological, and it was about your ability to simply exist. You know, nukes do that to the conversation. So we always knew from the beginning of the American-Soviet conflict of the Cold War that there could really only be one. And so when the Soviet Union fell in 1992, there was more than a little bit of celebration. And there was this wonderful part in the 1990s when we thought, you know, maybe we can recreate Russia in a different way to become different in some way where we don't have this bad blood between us and we can be a degree of partners. And when Vladimir Putin became president in 1999, prime minister in 1999, president in 2000, that general idea that maybe we really can all get along got a lot of lift, because Putin in his early days was an inveterate Westerner. And there was actually open discussion, maybe not all that serious, but discussion about Russia perhaps one day joining the European Union and NATO. And so what we've been dealing with now is kind of a reversion to the norm. Because the Russian ethnicity is the only one that has ever actually threatened the United States with physical annihilation, it's difficult to see any way out of this where we agree to try to get along again, especially now that the Putin government has repeatedly brought up the nuclear threat time and time and time again. It's like the one way to get the Americans' attention, although I would argue from the American point of view, America's attention is not what you're after if you're trying to prosecute a war in your corner of the world and not invite American intervention. It's, if anything, it brings us to the table in a very bad...
Putin's Ukraine victory in Soledar was thanks to mercenaries. After fierce fighting that lasted more than 3 weeks, Russian forces led by the Wagner Group private military company are most likely in complete control of Soledar. In its latest estimate of the war, the British military intelligence assessed that by the end of Monday, the Ukrainian military, highly likely withdrawn from the Donbas town of Soledar. The Ukrainian military has established defensive positions further to the west of the salt mining town, leaving Russian military and Wagner Group proxy forces in control. Russia's advance on Soledar primarily consisted of Wagner forces and was a supporting operation aimed to enable the eventual envelopment of the larger settlement of Bakhmut, the British military intelligence assessed. By capturing Soledar, the Russian forces are now closer to one of the main supply routes that support Bakhmut. The other one rests in the south of the town, and the Russian forces had been trying to reach that too. Meanwhile, in Bakhmut, the fighting continues in earnest. Both sides continue to rely on and employ long-range fires. Imagery shows that since the start of January 2023, the south and east of Bakhmut has continued to be subjected to intense artillery bombardment. Ukrainian forces almost certainly continue to defend against Russian forces on the outskirts of the city, the British military intelligence added. The Ukrainian forces continue to have an advantage in long-range precision fires, mainly through the M142 High-Mobility Artillery Rocket System, HIMARS, M270 Multiple Launch Rocket System, MLRS, and the M982 Excalibur artillery round used by the M777 155mm howitzers. But the Ukrainian commanders are very conservative with their targets, only using their precious precision missiles and shells for targets that are worth it. On the other end, the Russians are having ammunition shortages and have to fire selectively. Neither side seems to have a decisive advantage over the other, and so the carnage continues. The private military company has been instrumental in the fighting for Soledar and Bakhmut. Indeed, the Russian military has largely taken a back seat in the campaign to capture Bakhmut, with